In January 1956, one of the most decorated explorers in American history sat down for an interview with a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio. Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd had been to Antarctica 5 times. He had flown over both poles. He had a medal named after him, streets named after him, a mountain range in Antarctica named after him. He was the closest thing the United States had to a living legend of exploration. And in that interview, he said something that nobody in the mainstream press picked up. Nobody questioned. Nobody followed up on. He said that the United States needed to prepare its defenses against hostile forces, capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Not Soviet aircraft, not any identified enemy, hostile forces, flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds. In 1956, when no aircraft on Earth could fly from pole to pole at any speed, when the fastest jets in the American inventory could not cross the Atlantic without refueling, when pole-to-pole flight was not a military capability that any nation possessed. So what was he talking about? What had Admiral Richard Byrd seen that made him warn publicly in a foreign newspaper about a threat that no military analyst of the period could identify or explain? The answer is in what happened during Operation Highjump in 1947. The largest Antarctic expedition in American history, 13 ships, 23 aircraft, 4,700 personnel, authorized by President Truman, funded by the United States Navy, officially described as a routine scientific mission to test equipment and establish research bases, terminated weeks ahead of schedule. Byrd's report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff sealed and classified to this day. Byrd himself coming home quieter than he had ever been before, and spending the remaining 11 years of his life becoming progressively more withdrawn, more haunted, less willing to discuss the continent he had dedicated his career to exploring. This is the story of what happened to Admiral Byrd in Antarctica, what he saw, what he brought home with him that nobody could see, and why the last words he spoke to a man who had flown beside him during Operation Highjump were not words of triumph or pride or the satisfaction of a life well lived. They were a warning. Richard Evelyn Byrd was born in Winchester, Virginia in 1888. He came from one of the oldest and most distinguished families in American history. The Byrds of Virginia had been shaping American politics and culture since the colonial period. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1912. He learned to fly in 1917. And from the moment he first went airborne, he understood that aviation would change everything about exploration. In 1926, he claimed to have made the first flight over the North Pole. In 1929, he made the first flight over the South Pole. By the time the United States entered World War II, Byrd was a rear admiral and one of the most famous men in the country. His previous Antarctic expeditions before Operation Highjump had been extraordinary achievements. He had established permanent research stations. He had mapped vast stretches of previously unmapped coastline. He had spent 5 months alone in a small hut buried under Antarctic snow during the winter of 1934 as a meteorological experiment that nearly killed him. He had done all of this, and he had always come back the same man, energized, eager to return, eager to talk about what he had found and what remained to be discovered. That changed after Operation Highjump. Every person who knew Byrd before and after that expedition described the same transformation. He came back different. The man who returned from Antarctica in February 1947 was not the same man who had departed in December 1946. The change was not subtle. It was not the kind of exhaustion that a demanding expedition produces. It was something deeper, something that the people closest to him could not name but could clearly see. His son, Richard Byrd Jr., later described his father as having returned from the 1947 expedition with a weight on him that never lifted. His longtime aide, Commander George Dufek, who had served with Byrd across multiple expeditions, told colleagues privately that Byrd seemed to have seen something that he could neither speak about nor forget. The official debrief lasted weeks. The report that Byrd submitted to the Joint Chiefs of Staff has never been declassified. Not partially, not with redactions, not at all. In 77 years, no version of that document has entered the public record. For comparison, the CIA regularly declassifies documents from the same period. Nuclear test plans from the 1940s are available. Strategic war planning documents from World War II are available. The Byrd Antarctic Expedition Report from 1947 is not. That level of continued classification for a scientific mission is not normal. It is not standard procedure for expeditions of that type. And the people who made the decision to keep it classified were not doing so because the weather data was sensitive. Now, I need to tell you what Operation Highjump actually was, because the official description does not hold up under basic scrutiny. The Navy described it as a training exercise combined with scientific research. They said the purpose was to test equipment and techniques in polar conditions and to photograph and map the Antarctic coastline. This is the cover story that appears in every official document and most historical accounts. But look at the actual resources deployed. 13 naval vessels, including an aircraft carrier, the USS Philippine Sea. 23 aircraft, 4,720 personnel. This is not a research expedition. The Apollo lunar program at its peak employed around 400,000 people. Operation Highjump deployed nearly 5,000 for a supposedly routine polar mapping mission. The aircraft carrier alone was not necessary for coastline photography. Carriers are deployed for force projection, for sustained combat air operations, for launching and recovering aircraft over extended periods in contested environments. You do not need a carrier to map a coastline. You need a carrier if you are planning sustained air operations in an area where you need to be able to launch and recover aircraft continuously over a large region and cannot rely on land-based runways. Antarctica in 1947 had no land-based runways that could support American aircraft. The carrier was there because the mission required sustained air operations over a vast area, not because the weather data required a carrier. The resources deployed to Operation Highjump are consistent with a military reconnaissance and assessment operation, not a scientific expedition, and the termination of the mission weeks ahead of schedule is the detail that no official explanation has ever adequately addressed. Equipment failures and weather are normal parts of Antarctic operations. Byrd had dealt with both on every previous expedition. He had never terminated a mission early because of them. He had adapted. He had pushed through. He was not a man who turned back. And yet in February 1947, with weeks remaining in the planned timeline, the entire operation was packed up and the fleet sailed home. No official explanation was given that satisfied the journalists who covered Byrd's return. Several of them noted in their dispatches that the Admiral seemed reluctant to explain the reason for the early departure and deflected questions in ways that were uncharacteristic of his usual forthcoming personality. The Chilean newspaper interview happened 9 years after Operation Highjump, 9 years during which Byrd had said almost nothing specific about what the expedition had actually found. And then in January 1956, sitting down with reporters from El Mercurio, he made the statement that should have become one of the most discussed military warnings of the Cold War era. He said that in the case of a new war, the United States would be attacked by fighters that can fly with fantastic speed from one pole to the other. He said that America needed to be prepared to defend against hostile forces capable of this kind of movement. Let me put this in context. In January 1956, the Soviet Union's most advanced long-range bomber was the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear. It had a range of approximately 9,000 miles and a top speed of around 575 miles per hour. It absolutely could not fly from pole to pole. It could not even reach the Arctic from Soviet territory and return to Antarctica in any operational sense. No aircraft that existed in 1956 could do what Byrd was describing. No aircraft that exists today can do what Byrd was describing in the way he described it. Pole-to-pole flight at incredible speeds using 1956 technology was not a capability that any nation on Earth possessed or was close to possessing. So either Byrd was describing something he had encountered in Antarctica that was not built by any nation on Earth, or he was confused about basic facts of aviation and military technology that he had spent his entire career working with. The second option is not credible. Byrd was not confused. He knew exactly what aircraft could and could not do in 1956. He was not describing Soviet jets. He was describing something else. And he had encountered it 9 years earlier during the mission he could never officially discuss. I want to tell you about a man named David Bunger, a retired Navy pilot who flew alongside Byrd during Operation Highjump. Bunger had over 3,000 flight hours. He was a decorated combat veteran of the Pacific Theater. He was one of only 12 pilots selected for the expedition. In 1962, he sat down at his typewriter and wrote what he called the most important manuscript of his life. The manuscript was printed once by a small publisher in Ohio. Within 3 months, every copy had been pulled from circulation. The publisher refused to discuss it. Bunger died in 1968, and his family was told never to mention the document. For decades, it was considered lost. In 2004, a single copy surfaced in an estate sale in Oregon, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. What Bunger wrote is not the official story of Operation Highjump. It is what he personally witnessed, what he could not explain using any framework available to him in 1947, and what he spent 15 years trying to decide whether to make public before finally deciding he could not die without leaving a record. According to Bunger, the expedition detected electromagnetic signatures coming from beneath the ice, approximately 40 miles inland from the Bunger Hills region of Wilkes Land in East Antarctica. When reconnaissance aircraft descended to investigate, they observed geometric patterns visible through breaks in the ice, patterns that extended for miles, forming what appeared to be a grid system with structures spaced at regular intervals. The structures were partially exposed where the ice had receded. They were made of a dark, polished stone that reflected light in a way that Bunger described as wrong. His word, wrong. Like the material had been fused or molded rather than cut and stacked. When his aircraft circled for a second pass, the electromagnetic interference intensified until instruments began failing. The altimeter spun. The compass locked onto a bearing that had no relationship to magnetic north. The radio filled with rhythmic pulses that followed no recognized pattern, and the temperature inside the cockpit dropped 20 degrees in under a minute while the heating system ran at full capacity. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Davis, saw movement on the ice below. Not animals, not weather. Figures moving between the exposed structures in coordinated patterns. Davis photographed what he saw through the reconnaissance camera mounted in the aircraft belly. Those photographs were confiscated immediately upon landing. Davis was debriefed separately and reassigned within 48 hours. Bunger never saw him again. When he tracked down Davis's family years later, he was told Davis had died in a training accident in 1949. No obituary existed in any public record. A landing party was sent to investigate one of the exposed structures. 8 men, 2 scientists, 4 Marines, 2 naval officers, They established radio contact upon landing and began approaching a rectangular building partially embedded in the ice with an entrance descending underground. For the first 20 minutes, the reports were normal. The structure's exterior was smooth and featureless. No visible seams or joints in the stone, as if the entire building had been carved from a single piece of material. The entrance was a simple rectangular opening leading to a ramp descending at a gentle angle into darkness. One of the scientists noted that the temperature inside the entrance was 15 degrees warmer than the exterior air, not slightly warmer, 15 degrees warmer than Antarctic exterior temperatures in January, in a stone structure that had supposedly been buried under ice for thousands of years with no heat source. The Marines went in first, their boots echoing against stone floors that were smooth and level with no ice accumulation, despite the extreme cold just meters away. The scientists followed, their instruments detecting electromagnetic readings that spiked as they descended deeper. The naval officers remained at the entrance to relay communications. Then the tone of the Marines' voices changed. They described lights deeper in the structure, pale blue, steady, lining the walls at regular intervals every 10 feet, along both sides, receding into the darkness ahead. The light source was embedded in the walls, not mounted on them, no fixtures, no bulbs, no power conduits. The stone itself was emitting the glow. One Marine tapped his rifle stock against the wall near one of the lights. The wall absorbed the impact with a dull thud, as if the material had a composition that resisted percussion in ways stone does not. The scientists found text carved into the walls, symbols and characters that matched no known language. One was photographing it when the first Marine started shouting. The transmission cut out. The circling aircraft tried to re-establish contact. Nothing. Descending for a visual, they saw the two naval officers running from the entrance, looking back over their shoulders. Behind them, coming out of the structure, were figures, humanoid but wrong in their proportions, too tall, too thin, moving in a way that did not match human biomechanics, wearing no protective gear in sub-zero temperatures, moving in coordinated formation with the precision of military training. The two naval officers made it to the aircraft and took off immediately. The 6 men inside were never recovered. Their names appear on no casualty list from Operation Highjump. Their personnel files were expunged. It was as if they had never been part of the expedition at all. Admiral Byrd ordered immediate withdrawal after that incident. He held an emergency briefing with the command staff, where he stated that the expedition had encountered forces beyond their operational capacity, and that further engagement would result in unacceptable casualties. The mission was terminated. The fleet sailed home. The report was classified. The personnel were reassigned and separated to prevent them from comparing notes. A policy of complete silence was instituted regarding the true findings of the expedition, and Byrd went home and became a different man. He gave fewer interviews. He seemed haunted. He deflected questions about the 1947 expedition in ways that were uncharacteristic. He remained active in Antarctic advocacy, but in ways that focused on international cooperation and research access, not on the discoveries, not on what the expedition had actually found, because he could not talk about what it had actually found. In 1955, at a naval reception, he pulled David Bunger aside. They had not spoken privately since the expedition. Byrd told him that what they had found in Antarctica was not about science or history. It was about control. Control of narratives, control of resources, control of information that could rewrite humanity's understanding of its own past. He told Bunger to be careful. He told him that the suppression of what they had witnessed was not something that would be lifted, that the people who had decided to classify it had reasons that went beyond national security in any conventional sense. 2 years later, Byrd was dead. And 7 years after that, Bunger sat down at his typewriter and began the manuscript that was printed once and then disappeared. He was not a conspiracy theorist. He was a decorated naval aviator with a spotless service record and no reason to fabricate what he wrote. He had everything to lose and nothing to gain. He wrote it because Byrd had told him that the truth would eventually come out. And he wanted to make sure that when it did, there would be a record from someone who was actually there. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, 12 years after Operation Highjump. It prohibits military activity on the continent. It limits who can conduct research and where. It establishes a framework of international oversight that effectively controls access to Antarctica in ways that no other geographic territory on Earth is controlled. The timing is what should concern you. If the 1947 expedition found nothing of significance, why was an international treaty restricting access to the continent signed 12 years later? The treaty was not necessary because of territorial disputes. No nation was fighting over Antarctica. It was not necessary because of environmental concerns. Environmental protection was not a significant policy priority in 1959. It was necessary because multiple nations had been conducting operations in Antarctica in the years between 1947 and 1959, and all of them needed a framework for managing what they had found and ensuring that no single nation could reveal it unilaterally. The treaty is not a scientific agreement. It is a management agreement, and what it manages is not ice cores and penguin populations. It is access to whatever is underneath the ice that 13 ships and 4,700 people were sent to find in 1947 and came home from without ever officially describing what they had actually discovered. Byrd's last public statement about Antarctica was that it was the most important strategic territory on Earth. Not scientifically important, strategically important, and that whatever decisions were made about its future would determine the course of human history more profoundly than any political event of the 20th century. He said this in 1956, the year he also told El Mercurio about forces capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, the year before he died. He spent his last year alive saying things in public that nobody in the mainstream press knew how to process, because they did not have the context to understand what he was actually saying. Bunger's manuscript provides that context. So does the classified report that has never been declassified. So does the El Mercurio interview that no mainstream historian has adequately explained. The structures beneath the Antarctic ice are not going anywhere. As the ice retreats, more of them become visible to satellite imagery. As technology improves, the electromagnetic signatures Bunger described become harder to attribute to natural geological processes. And as more people pay attention to what is actually happening in Antarctica right now, the official narrative about what is down there becomes harder to maintain. The truth that Byrd warned Bunger about, the truth that Bunger hid in a Bible in Oregon, the truth that is still classified in a report that nobody has been allowed to read in 77 years. That truth has a way of surfacing. Byrd knew it. Bunger knew it. And the people who classified the report knew it too, which is why they have been so careful for so long to make sure that the name David Bunger does not appear in any mainstream historical account, and why the most famous Antarctic explorer in American history spent his last decade as a haunted man who could not talk about the most important thing he ever saw.